Cuba is being pushed to the edge. A US-driven energy embargo is plunging cities into darkness. Fuel is running dry, unrest is spreading, and everyday Cubans are paying the price. And now, Donald Trump is openly talking about taking Cuba, turning economic pressure into something potentially far more dangerous.
Cuba's a mess. It's a failing country, and they're going to be next.
Next. What could that mean? That's what we'll try to find out today, with a little help, of course. Andrés Pertierra is a historian at the University of Wisconsin and specializes in the history of Cuba and its relations to the wider world.
In short, it's basically the taking of existing policies and bringing it to a new level of extreme, not really seen since, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
The US and Cuba are neighbors. From Key West in Florida to Cuba's northern coast, it's only about 150 kilometers. So Washington has a keen interest in what's happening on the island.
So the possibility that Cuba, maybe not as a military base, though that has been a perennial concern going back to the Cold War, but also as a place where they can capture signals intelligence from the United States, which is only 90 miles away, and then transfer that intelligence to hostile actors abroad. That has been that has been a real concern. It is connected with other leftist governments in the hemisphere, but those are not like a military threat to the United States. Right? This isn't a case of Cuba's not North Korea, right? They're not building a nuclear missile. There's not a imminent danger. They are kind of a symbolic head of an anti-US bloc in the region, but they also have the authority and power to do that as a sovereign state. So it's hard to frame this as like an imminent danger along the lines of like Saddam Hussein in Iraq in 2003, where you have the WMDs as an excuse to invade. That doesn't exist in this case.
Relations between the two countries somewhat normalized under Barack Obama. That process became known as the Cuban Thaw. The US removed Cuba from its list of state sponsors of terrorism. Both countries reopened their respective embassies, and the president paid a historic visit to Havana. Donald Trump's approach was decidedly more icy, and in his second term, the US president has grown increasingly hawkish on Cuba.
I do believe I'll be having the honor of taking Cuba. That'd be good. That's a big honor.
Taking Cuba.
Taking Cuba in some form, yeah. Taking Cuba. I mean, whether I free it, take it, I think I could do anything I want with it. You want to know the truth? They're a very weakened nation.
Trump's Secretary of State is a decisive figure here. Marco Rubio is the son of Cuban immigrants and has long pushed for regime change on the island.
I think Cuba's in need of two things, economic reforms and political reform. You cannot fix their economy if you don't change their system of government.
During the first Trump administration, Marco Rubio was referred to, while he was still senator, as the shadow Secretary of State for Latin America. So basically, he was the one kind of pushing for more aggressive policies and sanctions towards not just Cuba, but also Venezuela. Cuba's the real target for him. This is not just something he clearly personally believes in. This is a political legacy issue, right? So if he can actually pull off regime change in Cuba, his long-term political career and legacy are set.
Rubio is also considered the main architect of Washington's intervention in Venezuela and an important point of contact for the interim leadership in Caracas. And there is an important connection here.
Basically, since 1959, Cuba has always been dependent on a patron state. It was the USSR for a long time. The 90s, it kind of scraped by with mostly Western European investment. A lot of it is Spanish. And then from 1999-2000 on, Venezuela became the new sugar daddy for Cuba, right? And what does that mean? Cuba would export contracts for its human capital, so like its doctors and technical experts. They would go to Venezuela, get paid less than market value for their services, and then Cuba would get paid. The government would get paid in cash, but also oils for doctors, and Cuba would then use some of this heavily subsidized oil, especially during the oil boom, and then consume some of it, and then refine and re-export some of it for hard currency. That was the model. The model was already entering into crisis in the mid-2010s because you have the combined crisis of the oil prices, which collapse, and then Venezuela gets hyperinflation, has its own problems. More and more of its oil needs to go to figuring out its own economic situation, and then in the 2020s, you also have the decline in oil output. So Cuba was already getting choked out just by the implosion of Venezuela. And then Trump's latest policy of an oil blockade from January of this year, combined with cutting off Venezuelan oil altogether by intervening and basically telling Delcy, no more oil to Cuba. What that does, it's basically like a kidney punch to an already infirm person.
So no more Venezuelan oil for Cuba, and the consequences are truly crippling for the island.
The national grid has collapsed, I think, 7 times now. Maybe 6, maybe 7. The blackouts last for 24 to 72 hours, depending on how long it takes the national grid to set up. And even when it's not in blackout, the provinces sometimes go 24 hours in a given neighborhood with no electricity. Like, the country is paralyzed at this point, and it's unclear like how much longer they can keep juggling the fact that the country imports 80 to 90% of its food, maybe more, and the fact that there's no energy to even transport like many of the donations they've been receiving. I've never seen the country like this. I don't think even the 90s.
A Russian oil tanker was allowed to dock in Cuba last week for humanitarian reasons, according to the White House. But the UN says the humanitarian situation has reached a critical tipping point.
The energy crisis is having a rather systemic and multiplying humanitarian impact, affecting all aspects of daily life in Cuba, health, water and sanitation, food systems, education, transportation, telecommunications. And the country has gone for more than 3 months without sufficient fuel, and the humanitarian consequences, as you might expect, continue to deepen every day.
Discontent is brewing. Cubans have been banging pots and pans in nightly demonstrations, and back in March, they ransacked a Communist Party building, the first attack on a government office in decades on the island.
There have been no elite defections. Mass protests can give state actors opportunities to join, but thus far in the case of Cuba, they have not. This is the same problem as happened in Venezuela. In the case of communist regimes, especially ones born of social revolution, there's actually a vast literature on this. They tend to be very, very durable to attempts at elite defection historically. There's no solution to the protests, and they're kind of stuck with protests that paralyze the country, but also the protesters don't break that glass ceiling and get into like destabilizing the entire political system, at least thus far.
So we have an energy shortage, a humanitarian crisis, anti-government protests, and vague but constant threats from the US. Let's actually take a closer look at those. When Donald Trump says he could take Cuba, what does he mean?
I don't know. Does Trump even know what he means? I mean, like a military occupation of Cuba. I think he's so far based on his foreign policy. I'm going to infer that he means more along the lines of Venezuela than a boots on the ground situation. That he's going to like take over through like basically turning it into a vassal state along the lines of Delcy Rodriguez in Venezuela, because Trump is kind of allergic to committing another 2003 Iraq deal, right? He said it even at the time when he was a tad more lucid, that de-Baathification was a mistake, all these forever wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were a mistake. And I think he knows that like a direct occupation of Cuba, especially if they're threatening guerrilla war, would be extremely unpopular. And if there's nothing that Trump hates more than a hit to his popularity, right? So I think it's more an idea of vassalizing Cuba, but so far that has eluded him because it's a very different political system. He may try it anyway. I mean, look at Iran.
It's safe to say that that's a prospect Cuba's authoritarian leadership would rather avoid, so they've been talking to the Trump administration.
Cuba está dispuesta a un diálogo con los Estados Unidos, a un diálogo sobre cualquiera de los temas que se quiera debatir o dialogar. ¿Con qué condiciones? Sin presiones. Bajo presiones no se puede dialogar.
And yet, it is taking place. Is there anything Cuba can put on the table to appease their unpredictable negotiating partner?
So I think that the leverage that the Cuban government has is that despite all the pressure, there has not been a political collapse. You have not had mass defections by the police or the military, and short of major military action, it may not happen. It's unclear. So that's their leverage. But obviously that's not enough leverage to fundamentally alter the state of affairs. So it's basically something that allows them to play for more time, but maybe they're waiting for elections in the US to kind of distract Trump, as, you know, especially as Trump may be reticent to start yet another war as his domestic support falters. But on the US side, I think the strategy is try to push for more and more economic reforms and concessions, just really like back the private sector as much as possible. And maybe that gives dividends, but that seems more of a mid to long-term strategy where they crack open the economy and force reforms like what they're doing with Venezuela. It doesn't really necessarily alter the status quo of the political system, especially because, as China and Vietnam show, you can have a market economy and a communist dictatorship at the same time. These things are not mutually exclusive.
The Cuban people have lived under severe government repression and foreign sanctions for decades. Over that time, millions saw no other option than to leave their country. Today, some 11 million people live on the island. And I'm wondering, who's thinking about them in all of this?
I don't really know who is on the side of the Cuban people between these two states. And I think that's kind of the long-term problem that the Cuban people have had. They're kind of stuck, trapped between these two immovable obstacles that keep squeezing tighter and tighter and tighter. And they're the ones who are being asphyxiated and crushed. And they don't really have a champion in this, unfortunately, or much power. But I do worry that if you force the government to collapse, you'll get exactly what you signed up for, but no one can predict what happens after that.
We can't predict it either, of course. Between talking and taking, a lot can happen. What it ends up being is something we will continue to follow closely for you. Thanks so much for your company. I'm Nicole Furley. Until next time.